Good morning, teacher. My group is talking about the topic of issuance of treasury bonds. These are the participants, and we will continue.
So, strengthening the capital market requires to appeal to a greater number of economic agents, such as suppliers and buyers. Mm, so, this appeal to um, this appeal to have a solid and better and deep market, as well as present circumstances, lead to a volatile and reflect high sensitive signs. Because of this, investors demand a high level of confidence to economists to put their money on. This has created room to bonds to expand on. Bonds have not only proved to be an instrument of debt for companies, for private entities, sorry, but governments too. The latter tend to not be in equilibrium due to improper government spending management, so they need to go to a local market or foreign market to raise capital, uh, thinking about the long term. Um, so this method helps companies and governments to attract investors in order to fund any kinds of projects, um, such as, for example, in the case of governments, um, building roads, bettering the infrastructure, and in the case of companies, um, investing in better tools to help the efficiency of the country, of the company, and many more. Mm, so issuing debt is a common way for businesses or agencies to raise money, as I said. And in the United States, mm, one of the most important responsibilities of the Department of Treasury is issuing debt. This debt is a core element of managing all the operations made by the government due to when the taxes are not when the tax collection mm, amount is not met. This government uses this, let's say, backup plan to fund their spending, and also because of this, um, people who buy bonds, if they held until maturity, they almost 100% get their money.
All right. So now talking about definitions, I'll talk about the treasury bonds, medium and long-term public security issued to finance government operations. Fiscal policy, a set of measures taken by the government or entities with regulatory capacities in a matter in order to influence the price level, production, investment, and employment. And sovereign bond issued by the government. Its yield is approximation of the country risk assigned by the market to the issuer. Next PPT, please. And now about the theoretical framework. Instrument of fiscal policy. The public spending, it is public expenditure, is the total expenditure made by the public sector in the acquisition of goods and services, and taxes. A compulsory contribution to state revenue levied by the government on workers, income and business profits, or added to the cost of some goods, services, and transactions. Next, please. Now, talking about the theory about the fiscal policy instrument. The theory of fiscal policy. Policy markers are assumed to have no other subjects but the promotion of the social welfare or the public interest of the citizens. Social welfare cannot be observed directly It does not depend on any single variable or indicator. It depends on several indicators, some of an economic nature and others of social nature. And next one, please. Now, talking about the assumptions of this theory is the first one, the existence of a nerve center that is of an office or a place where that rather abstract concept that we call government. Two, those who represent the government have only the public interest of the citizens in mind when they make the policy decisions. Number three, when it makes budgetary decisions, the government has available to it the best economic analysis that is the possible to get given the available resources. Number four, because fiscal policy instruments are generally embedded in legislation, they can only be changed by enacting specific new laws or by changing current laws. And lastly, number five, the executive branch must have as much control of the policy instrument as possible in a democratic society. And next PPT, please. Now we're going to talk about the reality. Number one, the absence of such a center because of conflict originated from different objectives on the part of policymakers, which in turn reflect different party affiliations or even geographical areas that they represent. Number two, the public interest or the social welfare should be the outcome of many objectives. Different citizens or regions or ethnic groups or demographic cohorts or different political parties inevitably give different weights to each of these objectives. Number three, often there is no economic analysis behind policy decisions. The decision often appears out of nowhere, or sometimes are justified because they reflect some electoral promise. Next one, please. Now the last two realities. Number four, parliaments tend to be law factories and complement themselves for the number of laws that they produce. And lastly, number five, frequent disagreements on the use of the instruments and on the goals to be pursued among ministries and coalition parties. Asymmetric information between policy markers on one side and on the other side the civil servants who draft the legislative proposal and as importantly, those who draft the rules that give specific content to this proposal. I will go with my partner.
Okay, in this point three, since we already explained what the fiscal policy already is, so we're gonna find a better understanding of this situation about what countries use treasury bonds for, and we'll be evaluating two different factors. The first one will be tax collection and also the public expenditure. The tax collection, we could say that the immediate purpose of this collection is to get money from different sources and economic activities. We also can subdivide this first factor in current revenues and capital revenues. The current revenues, we could say that is basically divided into sections. The first one is being tax revenues, mainly coming from the taxpayer citizens, like economic activities. And also we could say that we have import taxes, sales taxes, selective consumption taxes, etc. In our aspect of non-tax revenues, the tax collections come from interest of bank deposits, oil royalties, mining royalties, transfer of profits, etc. Talking about the capital revenues, this type of income is basically coming from donations, external transfers, or grants. Next slide, please. This second factor is the public expenditure. All matters related to the execution of actions previously budgeted for the development of a specific plan. So we do have here two different types of public expenditure. The first one is the current expenditure. The ones are destined to own a necessary operation of local governments, where we can define some of the payment of salaries, labor pensions, social benefits, or etc. When we're talking about capital expenditures, is oriented to generate the acquisition of non-financial assets in a long term. We would say more than 12 months. This could be physical places like buildings, constructions, financial assets, and others. Next slide, please. So since we already talked about tax collection and public expenditure, we're gonna relate this to an analogy about what happens in a government with the management of the money in a home. For example, if there's a man who receives, or a family who receives salary, they're supposed to get the salary for the next 30 days of the month. So what happens if in the day 10 or the day 15 or day 20, they run out of money? They will have to maybe ask a friend for money, go to the bank to ask for a loan, or maybe use their credit cards in order to reach the expenses they were supposed to get before. So the same situation happens with a government. In the case of government, since they already have budgets, what they're gonna expend for the next year, and what happened if in the month 6 or in the month 8 of the year they running out of money, they will have to start issuing treasury bonds. There is a graphic in the middle of the slide where you can see the evolution of Peruvian government revenues and expenses. There are two lines in there. The red line is implied by the expenses of the government. So we could see in the year 2014, the red line is going above the green line, which is represented by the internal revenues. So in this case, we could say that the expenses got higher than the revenues. This situation is typically situation when government maybe didn't manage their forecast greatly, or maybe when they have to assume something different that they were expected before. So to make a summary of what I said before, we could say that the countries use the issuing of treasury bonds in order to accomplish the money that they don't have at some certain time. So we're going to the next explanation.
Well, according to the literature, we're going to explain what it means to use treasury bonds as an object or as an instrument of finance the public income. In this case, we are going to focus on the green bonds. The green bonds are a specific type of bond issued by the government that is used to develop social and energetic sustainability programs. So the money received by the bonds are used in a good way. Among the type of different bonds issued by different Latin American countries are green, social, and sustainable bonds. These are characterized by being fixed income instrument associated with a project that is in line with the objective of green transition or with inclusive social development objectives. First, we have the Ecuadorian case of the green bonds. In January of 2020, Ecuador issued a social bond for $400 million to finance government's program Casa para Todos. This program consists of financing families that have homes that are considered irrecoverable or homes without or houses without a home. In Ecuador, a house is represented by a family. So if a family has a house that is irrecoverable, is accepted in the program Casa para Todos. There's also families without home, so farmers without home, they will get entered in the program Casa para Todos. This is an example of a use of a green bond, a bond used to develop a sustainable growth program. To finance social measures that help the Ecuadorian government to reduce economic impact of crisis, since these funds were destined for the creation of family bonds and loans to companies to solve to different losses generated by the crisis. Another example of the green bonds is, as I said, just the crisis generated by the pandemic. These funds retrieved by the green bonds were used to create social programs and loans to little companies in Ecuador to decrease the impact of the crisis for the pandemic of COVID-19. Uh, in accordance with the objective of the issues of green sovereign bonds, it's important of this fiscal policy tool to finance social and sustainable programs that can be sustained. Remember, green bonds are only used to sustain finance, social, and sustainable programs. They are not to use in other terms. In the next case, we have the case of the Chilean green bonds, where Chile issued about $14,400 million in social and sustainable green bonds between June of 2019 and March of 2020. This represents about 15% of the total debt of its central government, according to the Ministry of Finance of Chile. These sovereign bonds have multiple objectives to finance social and public investment programs. According to the Sustainable Bond Framework in Chile, the funds obtained from the bond issuance have been used to finance programs designed to prevent or alleviate the effects of socioeconomic crises, such as what happened with the COVID-19. These programs include the Employment Protection Law, the Family Income Support Bonus, the Emergency Family Income, the Municipal Solidarity Fund, loans or financial support to SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprise facing financial stress. As I just said, the green bonds were used as a social program to decrease the impact of the crisis of COVID-19. This is a good example of how bonds can be used to help the government. The next case we are going to talk is about the case of the Peruvian bonds. In the case of the Peruvian bonds, Peru has not issued green bonds, just normal regular bonds. Despite that fact, Peru issued a bond for $25,000 million, according to the information provided by the Ministry of Economic and Finance. This issue was carried out in order to finance the economic reactivation plans of 12% of GDP. As we said earlier, the crisis of COVID-19 have a negative impact in most of Latin American countries, having the strongest impact in Peru because the GDP decreased by 12 point of percent. That means that Peru have to issue a lot of bonds to finance many programs to help its economy. In another topic, we're talking about the evolution of yield to maturity or of the Peruvian treasury bonds. In this graphic, we can see that the yield to maturity analyzed is the 10 years, 5 years, and 20 years yields to maturity. As we can see in this period over here, from 2019 to 2020, the fluctuation of bonds was real big because of the start of the crisis, the start of the pandemic, and the start of quarantine. We can see in the last part of 2021, where the vaccines are starting to come to Peru, the yield to maturity of every bond are starting to rise, to increase. This is a good sign. The evolution of Peruvian bond yield have been fluctuating with periods with the behavior where the behavior is decreasing, as observed in the second quarter of 2019 due to COVID, growing negative expectations generated by the start of COVID-19 pandemic in China. The recovery has begun in 2021, where the vaccination has begun in Peru. This pattern is common in a lot of countries, such as Colombia, where 2019 shows a has a decrease, and in 2020 a recuperation. With the start of quarantine in Colombia, a higher decrease of the yield to maturity of these bonds. We can see also that in 2021, the bonds have recovered the yields because of the start of vaccination also. Uh, this is similar to the case of Peru between dates and volatility because many Latin American countries share the same variables of the debts and recuperation economics. The next case is the case of the Chilean yields to maturity. In this case, we are going to watch the 10 years to maturity and the 5 years to maturity, where we can observe that with the start of COVID-19 in China, the expectations are decreasing and increasing because of the uncertainty. But in the second quarter of 2020, the yield to maturity of the bonds highly decreased because of the start of quarantine and the expectation being too uncertain. And by the second quarter of 2021, we can see that Chilean yield to maturity is highly increasing because of the government rapid actions to vaccination to their country. In the next, we can compare the three countries based on the 10 years to maturity bonds. And we can see that in the case, first of all, Colombia 10-year to maturity bond is the white line. Peruvian 10-year to maturity bond is the blue line, and Chilean yield to maturity of the 10-year bond is the red one. We can watch, as we said earlier, that with the start of 2020, the three bonds decreased rapidly because of the quarantine declared in every country. But in 2021, because of the start of vaccination in these countries in the second quarter, we can see a rapid increase of the yield to maturity. We can say also with this graphic that the behavior of Colombian treasury bonds are more stable than the rest of the pair. And the Chilean yield to maturity have the bigger volatility. This is because of the instability of the government in terms of political policy. Peru is between those two. It has a strong volatility, but not as strong as Chile. We can see that 2020 has had a decreased volatility because of the uncertainty of the government, the continuous president, the bad decision of the administration in charge. With this the behavior, we can say that with the start of vaccination, the years to maturity are starting to recover and are a really good investment to make in the case of these three countries. In the case of the conclusion, every one of my partners is going to explain the conclusion they are they achieved by making this investigation.
So, as for the first conclusion, we have that bonds are a debt instrument which allow corporations and governments to raise money through selling them to any kind of investor. And in the long run, these investors will receive their due money, and also they'll receive their proper interests. Um, in the case of treasury bonds, um, the case of treasury bonds, they're used by governments to raise money, as I said very much earlier, to fund their spending and obligations. And these bonds are backed by said governments, and because of this, the risk of defaulting or the default risk is almost virtually none. And if these bonds are backed by a third world country, or let's say a developed country, I mean, no, yeah, as he said, as a developing country, sorry. So then the risk of the default risk is much greater due to um, for example, such as in the case of Peru, there this uncertain and instability of the economic and political aspect has almost caused panic among all the population and also through investors and sorry and yeah, the default risk is very much sorry higher in third world countries or developing nations because of the reasons I said.
Continuing with the explanation of the conclusion, this is the
Yes. Okay. So the use of government bonds issues by governments is directly related to the budget expenditure based on the fiscal policy of each nation. Because when a negative variation of what is collected through taxes and the government expenditure is already created, bonds emerge as one of the possible sources of extra income, because we could have different kind of this kind of financial variations, but one of those are the expenditure or the issuing of treasury bonds. The deficit can come from a miscalculation in estimates of collection, expenses not previously planned, anomalous behavior of the company or economy, sorry, or in some cases like the one we're dealing in this time, it could be like a strong pandemic, a strong healthy situation, or different ones that were not scheduled before. The next.
Continuing, based on the figures of the World Bank, it is inferred that the highest issuance of bonds by Peru is correlated to the greater impact of decline that its economy has had in 2020 due to the effects of the COVID-19 crisis. Given that Peru had an 11.6% decrease and its gross domestic product much higher than the decrease of its peer in South America, and also had the largest issuance of sovereign bond within $25 billion. Next.
Regarding the recommendation, we say that analyzing the antecedents that occurred in Ecuador and Chile that show that green sovereign bonds are the best option for investors because they are governed by the ECG variables, environment, social, and government. It is recommended that the government of Peru use this type of bonds to obtain financings in the future. According to Murata and Himori, the ESG variables are among the main factors that are performed to analyze the portfolio of investors. This is because these variables help the objective of sustained development that the country used to generate economic growth, reduce poverty and inequality. Therefore, Peru should focus its upcoming bond issues to finance projects based on this factor, that is, to issue sovereign green bonds. We recommend the Peruvian government to make its move with greater transparency and carry out actions similar to those of its peers, such as Ecuador and or Chile, who issued a detailed report on its money distribution and which sector it goes to. This way, there's no misunderstanding and misinterpretation in the structure of balance and accounts. Bond issuance is not the only instrument to boost GDP, since it is widely known that a tax rate is not optimal. Increasing public spending may help this problem. Circumstances such as what is happening currently in Peru should be utterly avoided to lower default risk. With this exposition, we say many thanks to the teacher and the students, and we conclude the exposition. Thanks.